Okay, welcome to this presentation of LBNL's Utility Scale Solar 2013 report. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I'm one of the authors of this report, along with my colleague Samantha Weaver. I'll be walking you through the slides today, hitting on highlights and key findings from this second edition of our Utility Scale Solar series. There are 22 slides in total, so this should take about a half hour. Here's a high-level outline of what I'll be presenting. I'll start off by talking a bit about the size of the market, just to provide some context as to why we're studying it. After that, I will describe and characterize the total population of utility-scale PV, CPV, and CSP projects from which data samples are drawn. And the reason for doing this is to identify any fleet-wide trends and project characteristics that could influence or perhaps be influenced by the cost, performance, and pricing data that we analyze later in the report. Next, I will run through highlights from the data analysis and 4 key topical areas, which include installed costs or prices, operating costs, capacity factors, and PPA prices. And then finally, I'll conclude with a rough indication of potential future market size, and that's based on data pulled from many interconnection queues across the country. Once again, this is the second edition in this annual report series, and before moving on, I just want to mention 2 things that are relevant to this second edition. First, we've changed how we define utility scale. Last year's inaugural edition considered any ground-mounted project that was larger than 2 megawatts in size to be utility scale. But in the second edition, we've increased that threshold to 5 megawatts for a number of reasons that I won't get into here, but that are detailed in a text box within the report itself. Second, last year when we launched the report series, we didn't think we'd still be struggling with data availability in the second edition, but it turns out that operating costs in particular have been hard to come by. So as you'll see when we get there, our O&M cost data are still quite sparse. Okay, so this graph of the PV market in the U.S. Really explains why we launched this annual report series last year. As you can see, the market is still quite young, but has been growing like a weed, with utility scale PV accounting for 60% of the record amount of new PV capacity installed in 2013, and that's up from just 5% as recently as 2008. Utility scale has been the largest sector of the PV market since 2012, and that's expected to continue through 2016. And it's not just about PV. CSP, or concentrating solar power, solar thermal, has been experiencing a bit of a renaissance in the U.S. as well, with more new CSP capacity added in just 2013 and 2014 alone than in all previous years combined, going all the way back to the mid-1980s when the first few projects were built. And with this growth in both PV and CSP, there's been a sort of a massive creation of utility scale project level data that are just waiting to be collected and analyzed, which is why we launched this new report series last year. Okay, so now I want to talk about what the total project population looks like, as that could influence some of the trends that we'll see later in some of the data, for example, in capacity factor data in particular. Perhaps not surprisingly, our utility scale project population is dominated by PV and includes 126 PV projects that were installed by the end of 2013, and that total more than 3 gigawatts in capacity. The next 3 slides will characterize this PV population in more detail, so that's all I'll say about it here. The population also includes 2 CPV, or concentrating photovoltaic projects, that were built in late 2011 and early 2012, and that total 35 megawatts. These projects are very similar in terms of technology, site quality, and also inverter loading ratio, which is a term that I have not defined yet, but will in just a minute or 2. And then finally, there are 16 CSP projects totaling 1,848 megawatts. 9 of these projects, totaling about 400 megawatts, are from the old SEGS Trough projects in California that were built in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Most of the remainder, which comes to about 1,300 megawatts, comes from 3 Trough projects and 2 power tower projects built in 2013 and in some cases spilling over into 2014. So as you can see, much of the CSP capacity in the project population is either very old or else brand new, which does limit what we can do with the data to some extent. Okay, these next three slides focus in on the PV project population more closely. This graph breaks out the PV population by module type, by whether the modules are mounted at a fixed tilt or on a tracking device, and also by commercial operation year. Echoing a comment that I made earlier about the market being young, you can see here that 92% of all utility scale capacity in the total population was built in 2011, 2012, or 2013. And if you go back just one more year to include 2010, that percentage increases to 98%. So it's a very young market. Although thin film modules held an early lead over crystalline silicon or CSI modules among utility scale projects, the market seems to have shifted decidedly in favor of CSI modules starting in 2011. And we'll see later that this shift coincided with a convergence in the cost of CSI and thin film modules. Finally, projects using trackers have become more common over time, accounting for 60% of the record amount of utility scale PV capacity installed in 2013. As a result of these trends, on a cumulative basis at the end of 2013, tracking CSI projects held a commanding lead over fixed tilt thin film projects, and they were followed by fixed tilt CSI projects, and then finally just a few tracking thin film projects. There's only 2 of these in the population, though we do expect to see a bit of an uptick in tracking thin film projects in the near future. Okay, the map here shows the location of all of the projects in the population, as well as the strength of the solar resource across the U.S., in this case based on what's known as Direct Normal Irradiance, or DNI, which is the measure that's most relevant to utility scale projects, and in particular to those projects that track the sun. 86% of the total amount of capacity in the population is located in the southwest, which of course is also a high DNI resource region. While the map shows a static picture of project location in relation to resource strength, the graph on the bottom right of this slide shows that the average fleet-wide resource strength has actually increased over time. In other words, more recent projects have, on average, been built in higher quality resource sites. And as we'll see later, this trend will impact the capacity factor data somewhat. Capacity factors will also be influenced by a noticeable trend towards higher inverter loading ratios. So let me define that term. In a nutshell, as module prices have fallen, developers have been increasing the size of the DC module array relative to the AC inverter rating, and they do this as a way to capture more revenue and enhance project economics. In the report, we call this DC to AC capacity ratio the inverter loading ratio, or ILR for short. The graph in the upper left shows what happens when a system is oversized, when the array is oversized, thereby boosting the inverter loading ratio. Essentially, you gain generation during the shoulder periods, and at least on sunny days, you end up sacrificing some generation during peak periods through what is known as power limiting or power clipping. And the basic idea is that the generation gain outweighs the loss, particularly in revenue terms if time of delivery pricing is used. The graph in the bottom right shows that the average inverter loading ratio within the population has indeed increased by project vintage, which we will see later has also helped to boost capacity factors by project vintage as well. Okay, so let's turn now to the first of the 4 types of data analyzed in the report. Here we see installed PV prices per watt over time, expressed in both DC and AC terms. For reasons explained in the report, AC capacity is more appropriate than DC for utility scale solar, but here we show installed prices both ways in order to provide a bit of continuity between this report and others that tend to use dollar per watt DC terms instead. After this slide, though, everything else you'll see in the rest of this deck will be exclusively in AC terms. So you can see here that installed prices have fallen over time, but really not all that much in 2013, at least among this sample of projects, which, by the way, accounts for about 80% of all PV capacity in the project population that I just described. Now, it's important to point out that this sample is, by definition, backward-looking, in that it only includes projects that were completely online by the end of 2013. Moreover, some of the installed prices for 2013 projects may have been negotiated and transacted a year or more in advance of 2013, which only exacerbates the time lag. As a result, the prices shown here may not match up with prices that you've seen elsewhere, and also may not be indicative of current market prices for projects that are to be built in 2014 or 2015. That said, there is anecdotal evidence that even forward-looking installed prices may be leveling off somewhat. For example, the Public Service Company of New Mexico, or PNM, recently filed for approval of 40 megawatts that it will build in 2015 at an installed price of $1.98 per watt, which is down only slightly from the $2.03 per watt that it paid in this year in 2014 for another 23 megawatts. And both of these prices of around $2 per watt are down a bit more from $2.25 a watt that it paid in 2013, and you can see that that actually represents the low end of the range up in the graph for that year. And also they're down even more substantially from $3.99 per watt back in 2011. So based on these PNM data points alone, we might expect to see installed prices decline a bit further in 2014, but then perhaps level out in 2015. Of course, this is only one set of data points or one anecdote, and it certainly may not be representative of the entire market. Okay, here we see the same data that I just showed you in the previous graph, but this time it's broken out by technology or module type, as well as by fixed tilt versus tracking. Probably the first thing you'll notice here is that the decline in installed price has been driven by projects using CSI modules, while thin film pricing has held relatively steady over time. CSI and thin film pricing largely converged in 2011, which happens to coincide with the sharp increase in the number of CSI projects seen in the total project population at that time. Since 2011, there have been only slight differences in average project costs across these various categories, with CSI being only slightly more expensive than thin film on average, and with tracking only slightly more expensive than fixed tilt projects. You can also see that the two CPV projects in the sample fall right around the average PV price in both 2011 and 2012. As we'll see later, though, these two projects have not performed quite as well as the average PV project in terms of capacity factor. Finally, within each year, there's still quite a bit of variation in installed prices, even when broken out like this. And some of that variation might logically be chalked up to differences in project size, since projects in our sample do range from a low of 5 megawatts up to 250 megawatts at the high end. Surprisingly, though, our data did not really exhibit economies of scale. The overall variation in price does seem to narrow as project size increases, but the average price level really does not seem to decline either among the sample as a whole or when broken out by module type and project configuration. Although it's hard to say what's behind this counterintuitive finding, one potential explanation could simply be that the economies of scale that obviously exist for PV are really only evident among projects that are less than 5 megawatts in size. And of course, no such projects are included in our sample. Okay, here we see installed prices for a small sample of CSP projects built since 2007. The sample is really too limited to identify any trends with any sort of clarity, but one potential item to note is that there does not seem to have been much, if any, cost reduction among trough systems since 2007, which stands in contrast to PV. Another potentially interesting data point here is that the difference in price between the two similarly sized Trough systems installed in 2013 is roughly $1.50 per watt. And that difference might be attributable to the cost of 6 hours of thermal storage that's built into the higher price project, but not the lower price project. Okay, let's turn now to operating costs. As I mentioned earlier, our O&M cost data remains stubbornly small, in part because two utilities that own quite a bit of solar capacity have really not been reporting their project level operating costs as they should be, and as a result we can't really do much more with the data than we did last year, which is to compare what little empirical data we do have to projections of O&M costs that are pulled from bond rating agency research. So the top graph here shows those projections for 3 different types of utility scale solar projects, while the bottom graph shows that the limited O&M cost data that we have been able to collect seems to largely conform to the early years of those projections. Specifically, PV O&M costs seem to be somewhere in the range of $20 to $40 per kilowatt year, while CSP without storage is higher, more like $40 to $60 per kilowatt year. And we'll continue to keep our fingers crossed for more data next year. Okay, let's turn now to capacity factors. Unlike with wind turbines and perhaps other technologies, improvements in the efficiency of PV modules tend to show up more as cost reductions rather than as improvements to capacity factor. This is because as module efficiency increases, developers either use fewer modules to reach a fixed amount of capacity, or alternatively they use the same number of modules to boost the amount of capacity installed at a given site. Either of these practices will reduce dollar per watt installed costs, but won't necessarily increase capacity factors. As such, all else equal, we wouldn't really expect to see a time trend in capacity factors, for example, across project vintages. Looking beyond the module, however, there are other factors which could in fact drive such a time trend. And I mentioned these factors earlier when looking at the project population as a whole, namely changes over time in site quality with respect to the solar resource, changes in the inverter loading ratio or ILR, and changes in the prevalence of tracking as opposed to fixed tilt projects. So the graph on this slide breaks out the sample-wide average capacity factor by project vintage going back to 2010. And as you can see, there's not much difference in capacity factor between projects built in 2010 and 2011, which makes sense once you consider the fact that the inverter loading ratio is roughly the same in both years, while the lower DNI or resource strength in 2011 is offset by a higher tracking prevalence. And those two things net out to some extent. In contrast, 2012 vintage projects show a significantly higher average capacity factor, and we can see that that's been driven by both a higher average DNI and also a higher inverter loading ratio, despite the fact that there's a bit less tracking prevalence. So to investigate this concept of sort of external drivers a bit more fully, this next slide takes a look at these 3 drivers in addition to the influence of module type. The sample-wide average capacity factor shown here is 27.5%, but there's obviously quite a range around that central tendency at the individual project level. And as also shown here, a good bit of that project level variation can seemingly be explained by these 3 or 4 factors. For example, projects in the highest solar resource bin over on the right have capacity factors that are 30 to 50% higher than their counterparts in the lowest resource bin over on the left. Tracking tends to provide a roughly 20% boost to capacity factor, at least within the 2 lowest resource bins. And then the difference in capacity factor between the highest and lowest ILR bins ranges from about 5 to 10%. Meanwhile, module type does not really seem to make a significant difference on its own. Okay, this graph focuses in on just the highest resource bin from the previous graph, so just those projects located at a site with DNI that's greater than 7 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day. And also in this case, I'm only looking at 2010 through 2012 vintage projects. And the purpose here is mostly just to further investigate this idea of a time trend being driven by DNI and ILR. Although the trends here don't perfectly conform to what we'd expect based on theory, this is, after all, empirical data. In general, the more recent vintages do have higher capacity factors, and in general, we can also see that those higher capacity factors are supported by a higher DNI and/or higher inverter loading ratio. Finally, if the two CPV projects were included in this graph, they are not included, but if they were, they would most appropriately be placed in the second bin from the right, given that their inverter loading ratio is 1.17 and that they employ tracking, albeit dual axis tracking rather than single axis tracking. Based on their capacity factors to date of around 20 and 25%, however, these two CPV projects appear to be underperforming relative to similarly situated PV projects. Okay, let's take a quick look at CSP capacity factors. These are all Trough projects, as the most recent 2013-2014 build-out is not yet reflected here due to the lack of a full year of operating history. Just one or two things to quickly note. First, the SEGS projects that are now roughly 25 years old are still, for the most part, chugging along, with SEGS 3 through 9 not too far below the Nevada Solar 1 project that was built in 2007. All of these projects, though, are performing at a capacity factor that is below what one would expect from a tracking PV project located in a similarly strong solar resource area. Okay, so turning to PPA prices, here you see two almost identical bubble graphs of levelized PPA prices from nearly 6.5 gigawatts of utility-scale solar projects, roughly 80% of which are either fully or partially operational at present, and that's the distinction that's drawn by the lower graph. These PPA prices are levelized over the full term of each contract after accounting for any escalation rates or time of delivery factors. And what you see is a strong downward trend in levelized PPA prices since 2007. Notably, the small to mid-sized projects in the sample do not appear to be any less competitive than their much larger counterparts. And although the CPV and CSP sample is quite small and is also by now rather dated, at the time those few contracts were signed, they were still competitive with PV. Unfortunately, we don't have any more recent visibility into that comparison across technologies, which is perhaps telling in and of itself. Okay, sticking with PPA prices, here up top we see that within each PPA vintage, represented here by the different lines, average PPA prices actually decline over time in real dollar terms. And this is simply because most of these PPAs do not escalate in nominal dollars, while those that do escalate typically do so at a rate that is merely intended to keep pace with inflation. So we're talking, maybe 2 to 3% at most. And these declining real prices are perhaps a useful visual illustration or representation of the value that solar can provide as a long-term hedge against the risk of rising fossil fuel prices. The bottom graph simply levelizes each of the individual lines from the top graph in order to provide a clearer picture of the downward price trend across vintages. This downward trend has been remarkably steady at almost $25 per megawatt hour per year through 2013, although the incremental decline so far in 2014 has been much more muted, which perhaps is only natural as prices have now fallen down to around the $50 per megawatt hour level. Now, given that $50 per megawatt hour solar is fairly big news, This slide uses a financial pro forma model to look at what it takes to reach a $50 per megawatt hour PPA price. And the approach we used here was to set all of the modeling inputs except for installed costs equal to values that are found within the empirical ranges that we've witnessed throughout this report. And then once all of those other inputs are set, we plug in the installed cost assumption that yields a PPA price of $50 per megawatt hour or less. As you can see in the top row of this table, an installed cost of $1.85 per watt will get you there, resulting in a sub $50 per megawatt hour PPA price. Now, $1.85 per watt is below the range of installed prices that we saw earlier, but not terribly so. In fact, given the backward-looking nature of our installed price sample, $1.85 per watt may very well be attainable now or in the near future in some cases. Now, I don't want to give the impression that $1.85 per watt is any sort of magic number or important threshold. Really, you could hit $50 per megawatt hour solar in a lot of different ways by tweaking, certain input assumptions in one direction and other assumptions in a different direction. Instead, this exercise is really meant to illustrate just one path to $50 per megawatt hour solar using inputs that are, for the most part, already being witnessed today. Now, at $50 per megawatt hour, utility scale solar is really starting to get pretty competitive. And it's even more competitive when considering the time of delivery value that it provides to utilities, which is what this next slide focuses on. The graph on the left represents a wind project, while the graph on the right shows a PV project. The shaded background of each graph shows the percentage of generation in each month that falls into one of Pacific Gas and Electric's 3 time-of-day periods. So either the super peak period, the shoulder period, or the night period. And you can see that wind generation is pretty evenly distributed between all 3 of these periods, while PV generation falls only into the super peak and shoulder periods. The individual markers, and by that I mean the triangles, circles, and dashes, these show PG&E's most recent time of delivery factors applied to a hypothetical base PPA price of $100 per megawatt hour. So you can see that you're always penalized with a price below $100 for generating at night. You're also slightly penalized for generating within the shoulder period, except for during summer months. Meanwhile, you are always encouraged to generate during super peak hours, and particularly so during summer months when the multiplier goes way up. Finally, the lines that are labeled post-TOD revenue for both wind and solar simply represent the $100 per megawatt hour base PPA price as modified by the time of delivery factors given the underlying generation profile of each project. So in other words, these solid lines represent the revenue that each project would actually earn over the course of a year. And you can see that solar does pretty well here, particularly in the summer months, while wind tends to more or less hug the base price throughout the year. On average, over the course of a full year, solar's time of delivery advantage over wind comes to around $25 per megawatt hour. And if you were to instead compare PV to a constant 24/7 flat block of wholesale power, solar's advantage would be a bit lower at around $20 per megawatt hour. Now this is a PG&E example, but the results are similar for other utilities in California. Finally, it's also worth noting that this is perhaps a fleeting advantage that PV currently has. As solar penetration increases further, the net peak load will shift later and later into the afternoon and evening hours when the sun is not as strong, and as that happens, PV's midday peaking profile will presumably no longer be valued as much as it currently is. And this is where storage or CSP with thermal storage can potentially play more of a role in the future. So to wrap this up, this report paints an overall picture of an increasingly competitive utility-scale solar sector which has installed costs and PPA prices that are falling at the same time as capacity factors have recently improved. In light of these trends, it really should be no surprise that there is a lot more utility-scale solar capacity in the pipeline. The graphs on this slide show the amount of capacity working its way through 37 different interconnection queues throughout the country. At the end of 2013, there were nearly 40 gigawatts of utility-scale solar in these queues, which is roughly 8 times the total amount of capacity in our entire project population at that time. The smaller inset graph shows that solar was in 3rd place overall within these queues, behind natural gas and wind, while the larger graph shows that this solar capacity is concentrated in California and the Southwest primarily. Now, I want to emphasize that not all of this capacity will ultimately be built. Some of these projects will eventually fall by the wayside. But it's also likely that whatever portion of this capacity does ultimately make it to commercial operations will try to do so prior to 2017, when the investment tax credit is scheduled to revert to 10%. And that means that we're in for a tremendous amount of new utility-scale solar capacity being built over the next few years, even if only half of the capacity in these queues ultimately moves forward within that time frame. And of course, along with this massive build-out of new capacity will come massive amounts of new data, and we look forward to analyzing all of the new data in future editions of this report. So with that, I thank you for tuning in. I hope it was informative. Here's a link to where you can find the report itself, as well as this slide deck and recording. As always, Samantha and I would be happy to field any questions that you might have, and probably the best way to reach out to us is via the email addresses shown here. And finally, we do of course appreciate the funding support of the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you. Please stand by.